When the popular kids from Westfield Heights decided to throw their 5-year reunion, they had one goal in mind: to invite David Chun, the quiet Asian kid they used to call Robot Boy, just so they could humiliate him one more time. They expected him to show up in his usual thrift store clothes, maybe working some dead-end job, so they could all laugh and feel superior about their own mediocre lives. What they didn't expect was for David to walk in wearing the same worn-out Converse and faded jeans, looking exactly like the loser they remembered, only to discover that this so-called failure had quietly built a $100 million empire while they were all busy posting fake success stories on Instagram. The moment David revealed his truth, every smug smile in that room turned to ash, and these arrogant bullies realized they had just invited their worst nightmare. But before we dive into this incredible story of ultimate revenge, if you're new here, smash that subscribe button because we're about to serve you the most satisfying comeback story you've ever heard. Trust me, you'll want to stick around until the very end. This story will leave you speechless. And if it moves you, drop a comment telling us what you would have done in David's shoes. Now, let's get into it. The invitation arrived on a Tuesday morning, slipped under the door of David Chen's modest downtown apartment like some kind of cosmic joke. The envelope was thick, expensive, the kind that screams, "We have money," even before you open it. Inside, golden letters spelled out Westfield Heights Class of 2019 Reunion, in that pretentious font rich people love so much. David stared at the invitation for a long moment, his fingers tracing the embossed letters. He remembered those hallways all too well. The endless corridors of Westfield Heights Academy, where his worn sneakers squeaked against marble floors that cost more than most people's cars. He was the scholarship kid in a sea of trust fund babies, the quiet boy who ate lunch alone while everyone else formed their exclusive little circles. They called him Robot Boy because he spent every free moment coding on his beat-up laptop, hunched over in corners where no one would bother him. "That weird Asian kid who never talks," they'd whisper, loud enough for him to hear. "Bet he'll end up working at some tech support call center his whole life." The cruel laughter still echoed in his memory, but it didn't sting anymore. Not after what he'd accomplished. You see, while his classmates were busy taking selfies and planning which overpriced college daddy would pay for, David was building something extraordinary. Every night after finishing his homework, he'd dive into lines of code, creating algorithms that would eventually revolutionize entire industries. While they were getting drunk at house parties, he was teaching himself advanced programming languages that most computer science graduates had never even heard of. The bullying got worse senior year. Brandon Martinez, the quarterback with more ego than brain cells, made it his personal mission to make David's life miserable. "Hey, Robot Boy," he'd shout across the cafeteria. "Still playing with your little computer toys? Maybe one day you'll fix my laptop for minimum wage." The whole football table would explode with laughter, slapping their knees like it was the funniest thing they'd ever heard. Then there was Jessica Winters, the head cheerleader who acted like she was doing charity work whenever she had to partner with David for group projects. "Don't worry, David," she'd say with fake sweetness dripping from her voice. "I'll handle the presentation. You just do whatever it is you do with those computers." She'd flip her blonde hair and giggle with her friends, never bothering to hide her disgust at having to work with the weird kid. And Ryan Foster, oh, Ryan was the worst of them all. Son of a tech billionaire, he thought he knew everything about the industry because daddy owned a few software companies. "You think you're so smart with your coding," he'd sneer, cornering David by his locker. "But you don't understand how the real world works. It's about connections, not code. You'll never amount to anything because you don't have what we have: money, status, power." David would just nod quietly, never fighting back, never defending himself. Because he had learned something powerful that none of them understood. Silence wasn't weakness. It was strategy. While they wasted energy on petty drama and social climbing, he was channeling every ounce of his focus into building something that would change everything. The day David graduated, he made himself a promise. He wouldn't just succeed. He would build an empire so massive that these bullies would choke on their own arrogance. He didn't want revenge in the traditional sense. He wanted something much more satisfying. He wanted to become so successful that their mockery would sound like prophecies spoken by fools. So when that reunion invitation arrived 5 years later, David couldn't help but smile. A slow, knowing smile that would have made his former classmates nervous if they could have seen it. Because while they thought they were setting up another opportunity to humiliate him, they were actually giving him the perfect stage for the greatest comeback in Westfield Heights history. David looked at his reflection in the bathroom mirror of his modest apartment. The same dark hair falling over his eyes, the same quiet expression that used to make his classmates think he was weak. He could afford a penthouse now, multiple penthouses actually, but he chose to live simply. Not because he had to, but because he wanted to, because true power doesn't need to show off. He pulled on his oldest pair of jeans, the ones with a small hole near the left knee that he'd been meaning to throw away for months. Then his favorite hoodie, gray, worn soft from countless washes, with a faded logo from some tech conference he'd attended as a teenager. Finally, those same Converse sneakers that had squeaked through the halls of Westfield Heights, now held together with determination and duct tape. Looking at himself, David knew exactly what his former classmates would see. The same loser they remembered. The same quiet kid who never seemed to have $2 to rub together. They would look at his clothes and think he'd never left that box they'd put him in. They had no idea that beneath that humble exterior was a mind that had revolutionized artificial intelligence, created technologies that major corporations were scrambling to license, and built a business empire worth more money than they could imagine. The reunion was being held at the Grandview Country Club, the same pretentious venue where Westfield Heights held all their exclusive events. David had been there before, not as a guest, but as the kid whose mom cleaned the bathrooms on weekends to make ends meet. He remembered hiding in supply closets when the rich families came for their parties, embarrassed that his mother had to scrub toilets so he could afford his school supplies. Now, as his Uber pulled up to the imposing entrance, David felt a strange sense of déjà vu. The same valet stands, the same manicured gardens, the same air of artificial sophistication that he'd always found nauseating. But this time was different. This time he wasn't sneaking in through the back door. The main ballroom was exactly as he remembered. Chandeliers that probably cost more than most people's houses, marble floors polished to mirror perfection, and tables draped in white linen with gold accents. His former classmates were already mingling, dressed in their finest clothes, desperate to prove to each other that they'd made it in the world. David walked in quietly, the same way he'd always moved through crowds. Like a ghost, barely noticed until someone actually looked. And when they did look, the reactions were everything he'd expected. Brandon Martinez spotted him first. The former quarterback had gained about 40 pounds and lost most of his hair, but his arrogance was still intact. "Holy crap," Brandon laughed, nudging his wife. A bleached blonde who looked like she'd married him for his daddy's insurance money. "Look who decided to show up. It's Robot Boy." The laughter started as a ripple and spread through the room like a disease. Heads turned, whispers started, and David could feel the familiar weight of their judgment pressing down on him. But this time, instead of making him want to disappear, it made him feel powerful. Because he knew something they didn't. Jessica Winters sashayed over in a dress that probably cost more than David's monthly rent. Well, more than what his monthly rent would be if he actually paid market rate for his apartment instead of owning the entire building. "David Chun!" she squealed with fake enthusiasm. "Oh my God. You look exactly the same. That's so sweet." Her friends giggled behind their hands, and David could practically hear their thoughts. Poor David, still shopping at thrift stores, probably still lives with his parents, definitely still a virgin. If only they knew that his old clothes were a choice, not a necessity, and that he'd turned down dates with supermodels because he was too busy building his empire. Ryan Foster approached with the swagger of someone who'd never faced real adversity in his life. He was wearing a suit that probably cost more than most people's cars, but David could see the desperation in his eyes. The look of someone trying too hard to prove he belonged in his daddy's world. Well, Ryan smirked, extending a hand that David noticed was trembling slightly. "David Chun, as I live and breathe. Tell me, buddy, what are you up to these days? Still playing around with computers in your mom's basement?" The circle of former classmates that had gathered around them erupted in laughter. They were like vultures circling wounded prey, excited by the prospect of fresh meat to tear apart. David shook Ryan's hand, noting the expensive watch that was probably a desperate attempt to impress investors, and smiled quietly. "Something like that," David replied simply, his voice calm and steady. He wasn't ready to play his hand yet. The game was just beginning. The evening continued exactly as David had predicted. His former classmates took turns trying to one-up each other with exaggerated stories of their success. Brandon bragged about his thriving insurance business, conveniently leaving out the part where he'd been sued 3 times for fraudulent claims. Jessica went on and on about her exclusive boutique, failing to mention that it was hemorrhaging money and would be closed within 6 months. But Ryan Foster was the worst of all. He dominated every conversation, name-dropping clients and bragging about deals that David strongly suspected were either greatly exaggerated or completely fictional. "You know, David," Ryan said during dinner, his voice carrying that same condescending tone from high school, "I could probably throw some work your way. My dad's company is always looking for basic IT support. Nothing too complicated, of course, but it might help you get back on your feet." The table fell silent, waiting for David's reaction. This was the moment they'd all been waiting for, the chance to see the weird kid get put in his place once again. David could feel their excitement, their hunger for his humiliation. It was almost pathetic. "That's very kind of you, Ryan," David said, cutting into his steak with precision. "But I'm pretty happy with my current situation." "Oh, come on," Jessica laughed, the sound sharp and cruel. "Don't be proud, David. We all know times are tough for people like you. There's no shame in accepting help from old friends." "People like me?" David asked quietly, his voice still calm. "You know what she means," Brandon chimed in, his face red from too much wine. People who never really figured out how to succeed in the real world. Look, we're not trying to be mean here, but it's been 5 years, man. Shouldn't you have, I don't know, accomplished something by now?" The cruelty in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. These people, who had peaked in high school, were desperately trying to recapture that feeling of superiority by tearing down someone they perceived as weak. They had no idea they were poking a sleeping dragon. David set down his fork and looked around the table. Really looked at them. Brandon, with his failing insurance scams and receding hairline. Jessica, with her boutique that was drowning in debt and her husband who was probably cheating on her with his secretary. Ryan, with his desperate need to prove he was worthy of his father's empire, even though everyone knew he was just a disappointment waiting to happen. They were all so pathetically eager to believe that they were better than him, so hungry for validation that they'd organized this entire reunion just to have someone to look down on. Well, David thought to himself, if they wanted a show, he'd give them one they'd never forget. "You're absolutely right," David said, his voice carrying a new tone that made a few people lean forward unconsciously. 5 years is a long time. I have accomplished some things." "Like what?" Ryan challenged, his voice getting louder. "Come on, David. Don't be modest. Tell us about your great success story. What's your job title? Senior button pusher? Head mouse clicker?" The table erupted in laughter again, but this time David noticed something different. A few people weren't laughing as hard. A couple of them were looking at him with something that might have been uncertainty. Because despite his humble appearance, there was something about David's energy that had changed. Something that suggested they might have miscalculated. David reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. Not the latest iPhone, just a simple Android device that looked like it had seen better days. His classmates smirked, probably thinking it was some cheap burner phone that proved their point about his financial situation. "I suppose I should show you what I've been working on," David said, tapping the screen with one finger. The phone's brightness seemed to illuminate his face in a way that made his expression unreadable. On the large screen mounted on the wall behind the head table, the same screen they'd been using to show embarrassing photos from high school, an image suddenly appeared. It was a business logo, clean and professional. Chen Dynamics, Artificial Intelligence Solutions. A few people squinted at the screen, not quite understanding what they were seeing. But Ryan Foster's face went pale. His father was in tech, which meant Ryan had heard whispers about Chun Dynamics in industry circles. Whispers about a mysterious company that was quietly revolutionizing AI technology. Whispers about contracts worth hundreds of millions of dollars. "Wait," Ryan said, his voice suddenly much quieter. Are you saying you work for Chun Dynamics?" David's smile was small, almost apologetic. "Not exactly," he said. "I don't work for Chun Dynamics. I am Chun Dynamics. I founded it 5 years ago, right after we graduated." The silence that followed was different from the expectant quiet that had preceded their laughter. This was the silence of understanding, of reality crashing down on carefully constructed delusions. This was the sound of 30 privileged bullies realizing they had just made the biggest mistake of their lives. That's impossible," Jessica stammered, her perfectly applied makeup suddenly looking like war paint in the harsh light of her own stupidity. "Chun Dynamics my husband works in finance, and he says they're one of the most valuable private companies in the world." David nodded thoughtfully. "We've had some good years," he said with the same modest tone he'd used in high school. "Last quarter we signed contracts worth about $200 million. Microsoft wants to license our technology for their new AI platform. Google's been calling nonstop. Apple sent their CEO to my office personally to discuss a potential partnership." Brandon's wine glass slipped from his fingers and shattered on the floor, red liquid spreading across the white tablecloth like blood. $200 million? He repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. "That was just 1 quarter," David continued, seemingly oblivious to the devastation he was causing. "Our annual revenue is, well, let's just say it's substantial. The company's current valuation is approximately $120 million, which makes my net worth," he paused, letting the implications sink in, "considerably higher than that." The weight of his words settled over the table like a suffocating blanket. These people, who had spent the entire evening trying to make David feel small, suddenly realized that they were looking at someone who was worth more money than their entire extended families combined. Ryan Foster looked like he was going to be sick. His father's company, which Ryan had been bragging about all night, was worth maybe $20 million on a good day. David, quiet, weird David who used to eat lunch alone, had built something 5 times larger from absolutely nothing. But you're dressed like a homeless person," Jessica said weakly, gesturing at his old clothes with a trembling hand. David looked down at his hoodie and jeans, then back at her. "These clothes are comfortable," he said simply. "I have suits that cost more than some people's cars, but I prefer this. When you don't need to impress anyone, you can wear whatever makes you happy." The implications of that statement hit like a physical blow. David didn't need to impress anyone because he had already won. He had surpassed them so completely that their opinions were literally worthless to him. He wasn't trying to prove anything. He was just existing at a level they couldn't even comprehend. Brandon tried to recover the way drowning men grasp at straws. "Well, money isn't everything," he said, his voice cracking slightly. "There's more to success than just numbers." David nodded seriously. "You're absolutely right, Brandon. Money is just a byproduct of doing work that matters. What I'm really proud of is the technology itself. We've created AI systems that can predict market trends with 97% accuracy. Our medical diagnostic AI has identified diseases that human doctors missed, saving thousands of lives. Our environmental modeling software is helping cities reduce their carbon footprint by up to 40%. With each accomplishment David listed, his former classmates seemed to shrink a little more. These weren't just business victories. They were contributions to humanity that would outlast anything any of them had ever done or would ever do. "Last month," David continued, his voice still maddeningly calm, "I was invited to speak at the World Economic Forum. Next week, I'm having dinner with the Secretary of Technology to discuss how our AI can help with national security initiatives. Time magazine wants to put me on their cover for their Innovators Under 30 issue, but I'm probably going to decline. I don't really like the spotlight." The cruel irony was not lost on anyone at the table. David, the boy they had mocked for being invisible, had become so successful that he was actively avoiding publicity. Meanwhile, his former classmates were desperately posting fake success stories on social media, hungry for any kind of recognition. Ryan made one last desperate attempt to maintain his dignity. "Well, congratulations, David," he said, trying to inject some authority back into his voice. "But you have to understand, success in the tech world is different from success in the real business world. What you've built is impressive, but it's still just computers." David's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes shifted, something that made Ryan take an involuntary step backward. "You know what's interesting about that, Ryan?" David said quietly. "Your father's company, Foster Enterprises, has been trying to modernize their systems for the past 2 years. They've spent millions on consultants, but they can't seem to figure out how to integrate AI into their workflow." Ryan's face went from pale to gray. How do you know about that?" "Because 6 months ago, your father's company approached mine," David continued. "They wanted to license our technology to save their failing infrastructure division. I reviewed the proposal personally." The silence stretched like a taut wire, ready to snap. "I turned them down." Ryan looked like he'd been physically slapped. You turned down my father?" "I turned down a company that was desperate enough to offer me $40 million for technology they didn't understand, to solve problems they created through decades of mismanagement," David corrected gently. "It wasn't personal. It was just bad business." The devastating precision of this revelation was like watching a master surgeon perform an operation. David hadn't just succeeded. He had succeeded so completely that he was now in a position to reject the empire that Ryan had been desperately trying to inherit. Jessica tried to change the subject, her voice high and strained. "Well, I think it's wonderful that you've done so well, David. Really, we're all happy for you." "Aren't we happy for David?" Everyone. A few people mumbled agreement, but it sounded like mourners at a funeral, which, in a way, they were. They were mourning the death of their superiority, the comfortable delusion that they were better than the weird kid from high school. David looked around the table one more time, his gaze lingering on each face. These people who had made his teenage years miserable, who had convinced him that he was worthless, who had laughed at his dreams and mocked his ambitions. Now they sat before him, diminished and exposed, their cruelty revealed as the desperate actions of insecure children. But instead of feeling triumphant, David felt something unexpected: pity. These people were so small, so limited in their thinking, so trapped by their own insecurities that they had never even imagined the possibility that the quiet kid might become something extraordinary. "I want to thank you all," David said, standing up from his chair. His voice carried to every corner of the silent ballroom. "Seriously, you have no idea how much you helped me." Confused glances were exchanged around the room. "You see," David continued, "every time you called me weird, every time you laughed at my dreams, every time you made me feel like I didn't belong, you were giving me a gift. You were showing me exactly what I didn't want to become." His words cut through the air like a blade. "You taught me that popularity is temporary, that status based on putting others down is worthless. That real success isn't about being better than someone else. It's about being better than you were yesterday." Brandon shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Jessica stared at her hands. Ryan looked like he wanted to disappear. "While you were all busy trying to maintain your social hierarchies, I was learning that the only competition that matters is with yourself. While you were laughing at my old clothes, I was building something that would change the world. While you were planning parties and worrying about who was dating whom, I was creating technology that will still be helping people long after we're all gone." David reached into his pocket and pulled out a business card, simple, elegant, with just his name and the Chun Dynamics logo. He placed it on the table in front of Ryan. "If your father's company is still interested in licensing our technology," David said quietly, "have him call my office. But tell him the price has gone up. I'm now charging $50 million for what I would have given him for 40. Ryan stared at the card like it might bite him. David walked toward the exit, then paused and turned back to address the room one final time. "Oh, and one more thing," he said, his voice carrying that same gentle tone that had always made them think he was weak. "The reunion tonight, the venue, the catering, the open bar, I paid for all of it. Consider it my gift to you. A thank you for teaching me exactly who I never wanted to be." The stunned silence that followed was absolute. 30 people who had gathered to mock a perceived failure had just discovered that their victim had not only paid for their own humiliation, but had done so as a gesture of pity rather than revenge. As David walked toward the exit, his old Converse squeaking slightly on the marble floor, he heard the first whisper break the silence. "Did he just say he paid for tonight? How much do you think this costs? Oh my God, we're such idiots." David didn't turn around. He had said what he came to say, proved what he'd needed to prove, and given his former classmates a lesson they would never forget. As he stepped out into the cool night air, he felt lighter than he had in years. Behind him, in the ballroom, the reunion continued, but the energy had completely changed. The laughter was gone, replaced by uncomfortable conversations and awkward silences. People started leaving early, unable to shake the feeling that they had just witnessed something that would haunt them for years. Brandon Martinez went home to his wife and spent the night staring at the ceiling, wondering how many other opportunities he had missed while he was busy being cruel to people he thought were beneath him. Jessica Winters found herself looking at her failing boutique with new eyes, realizing that she had spent so much time judging others that she had never learned to judge herself honestly. And Ryan Foster? Ryan spent the next 3 days trying to convince his father to apologize to David Chun and beg for another chance to license his technology. But it was too late. Chun Dynamics had already signed an exclusive deal with their biggest competitor, effectively putting Foster Enterprises out of the AI business forever. David Chun returned to his modest apartment, hung up his old hoodie, and sat down at his computer to continue working on his next innovation. A revolutionary approach to quantum computing that would probably make him another $50 million before the year was out. But as he coded into the early hours of the morning, David wasn't thinking about money or revenge or vindication. He was thinking about a quiet teenager who had once eaten lunch alone, who had been mocked for his dreams, who had been told he would never amount to anything. That boy had grown up to prove that the most dangerous person in any room is the one everyone underestimates. The quiet one. The weird one. The one who listens while others talk, who learns while others laugh, who builds while others tear down. David Chun had become living proof that in the real world, the losers often become the winners, and the bullies almost always get exactly what they deserve. A front row seat to watch their victims soar far beyond anything they ever thought possible. And as the sun rose over the city, casting long shadows through his apartment windows, David smiled to himself and continued typing, creating the future while his former classmates were still trying to understand their past. Because sometimes, the best revenge isn't getting even. It's getting so far ahead that looking back becomes impossible. Sometimes, the greatest victory is not proving you're better than your enemies, but proving you're so much better that they're no longer worth considering enemies at all. And sometimes, the quiet kid who everyone overlooks becomes the person everyone wishes they had been kind to when it mattered. David Chun understood all of this as he worked through the night, building tomorrow while his former classmates were still trapped in yesterday, creating value while they were still creating excuses, and proving once and for all that the real losers in high school are the ones who never learned to see potential in other people. The boy they called Robot Boy had become a man worth $100 million. But more importantly, he had become a man who understood that true success isn't measured in money. It's measured in the impact you have on the world and the kindness you show to people who can't do anything for you in return. And that, more than any fortune, was something his former classmates would never be able to afford. So the next time you see someone being bullied, someone being overlooked, someone being told they're not good enough, remember David Chun. Remember that the quiet ones are often the most dangerous. Remember that kindness is an investment that always pays dividends. And remember that in the game of life, it's not how you start that matters. It's how you finish. Because sometimes the class loser becomes the biggest winner of all. And sometimes that's exactly what the bullies deserve to see. What do you think? Would you have handled the situation like David did? or would you have taken a different approach? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories that prove kindness always wins in the end.